תזיז את הדגל, אני רוצה לצלם.
שוחחתי בימים האחרונים עם המונים מכם, וגם אתמול עמדתי פה על הבמה. לכל מי שדיברתי איתו היה ברור שיש סיכוי שהחוק הזה יעבור. אז תרימו כולם את הראש, קחו אוויר, הביטו סביב, בואו נגבה את כל אלה שיצטרכו לבחור בתקופה הקרובה בין אור לחושך, בין דיקטטורה לדמוקרטיה. יש לנו אחד את השנייה מעכשיו וקדימה, ויש לנו מצפן ויש לנו מצפון, ואנחנו נהיה דמוקרט.
It's a sad day to the Israeli democracy. The law will enable this government to pass any law that they would like to appoint any person to a position, regardless of their skills or background, and we're going to fight back.
היום ביצענו מהלך דמוקרטי מתבקש. המהלך נועד להחזיר מידה של איזון בין הרשויות, מה שהיה פה במשך 50 שנה. העברנו את התיקון לעילת הסבירות כדי שהממשלה הנבחרת תוכל להוביל את המדיניות בהתאם להחלטת רוב אזרחי המדינה.
Thousands of protesters are clashing with police in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, with burning wood being thrown at demonstrators and police charging at the crowds on horses. The tensions and violence follow the approval of the first major clause in Prime Minister Netanyahu's plan to overhaul the country's justice system. The vote was passed unanimously on Monday by Netanyahu's governing coalition after the opposition stormed out of the hall. Tens of thousands gathered outside the Knesset and Supreme Court in Jerusalem and blocked Tel Aviv's main highway. At least 22 people were arrested, some violently. This group of policemen punched a man several times whilst keeping him pinned to the ground, their colleagues blocking the view from onlookers. In Tel Aviv, the driver of a car rammed through crowds of demonstrators, fortunately only injuring 3 people. In the south of the country, near Be'er Sheva, more scuffles between supporters and opponents of the judicial overhaul, leading to one security guard firing his gun into the air. Other texts of the controversial judicial reform are due to be voted on in the coming months. The opposition, who has denounced this bill as a threat to Israel's democracy, intends to continue responding with this mass mobilization.
opposition lawmakers inside the Knesset chanted shame, and some tore up documents before walking out.
מי שאינו מעוניין להצביע מוזמן לצאת, מי שלא נעזור לו.
These acts of protest came after it was clear opponents could not block a bitterly divisive plan to overhaul the Israeli judiciary from clearing a vote in parliament on Monday. The bill, which curbs the country's Supreme Court's ability to overrule decisions by the government and ministers, passed in a 64-0 vote in the 120-member legislature. When the vote was called, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu answered in the affirmative.
Benjamin Netanyahu.
It's a political victory for his hardline religious nationalist coalition, but one that has provoked a political crisis and sparked the largest mass anti-government protests in the country's recent history. Tens of thousands of Israelis took to the streets for weeks, blocking traffic and likening Netanyahu to a dictator. Two of the country's biggest banks said they would allow workers to demonstrate on Monday without losing pay. A forum of some 150 of Israel's largest companies went on strike, and two of the nation's largest shopping malls said stores would stay shut. Critics say the overhaul would undermine a key pillar of Israeli democracy, and the protests have prompted warnings from the army's top brass about the state's military readiness. Supporters of the move inside Netanyahu's coalition say the changes are needed to restore balance to the different branches of government. They posed for selfies and slapped one another on the back after the measure passed. U.S. President Joe Biden's administration urged the Israeli government to find a compromise, but Monday's vote comes after all such efforts seem to have failed. In the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, protesters vowed not to back down.
Protesters and police in Israel have been clashing over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to limit the Supreme Court's power in the country. Demonstrators blocked several major highways during nationwide protests. At least 70 people have been arrested across the country. BBC Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman joins us now from the airport in Jerusalem. Tom, what's the situation on the ground like right now?
Well, it's been extraordinary here at Ben Gurion Airport, the main international airport in Israel, where we've seen over the last few hours thousands of protesters flood here, both on the roads and also on the trains from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and make their way to the main terminal here. Now, you can see that flag-waving protesters have now been starting to leave again. They're heading over this way, back towards the train station. Israeli security forces were preventing them from getting close to the terminal building itself. We're outside arrivals here. But we saw extraordinary scenes as passengers were arriving, families with their suitcases trying to leave, and these thousands of protesters outside. Now, the security forces were trying to clear a path to allow people through, but we saw some quite angry scuffles and clashes during that period of time. And elsewhere in the country, both in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and other cities in Israel, where confrontations have been taking place, these judicial reform plans by the Israeli government back on, and the opponents to it, the demonstrators, a new determination to try and stop them happening.
Tom, thank you so much. For more on the protest, let's bring in CBS News contributor Robert Berger, who is in Jerusalem. All right, Robert, can you please walk us through what is Netanyahu's plan to limit the power of the Supreme Court, and how different is this from what we saw just a few months ago that was kind of paused when these same protests happened?
Well, the pause has ended, and the negotiations to try and find a compromise collapsed. So last night, the Knesset, Israel's parliament, gave initial approval of a bill that would limit the power of the Supreme Court to overturn decisions by the government. In other words, more power for the government and less for the Supreme Court, and some fear even unlimited power for the government. So what the protesters are saying is that this is a threat to democracy. They fear that Netanyahu is leading the nation to authoritarian rule and even a dictatorship. They often use that word.
Where do you see this going? I mean, last time the protesters had somewhat of a victory, but do you see them being successful again? What's different this time?
A lot of momentum now for the protesters. I mean, each week they've been able to bring out tens of thousands of people onto the streets. We just saw at the airport there in Tel Aviv causing disruptions. And, you know, this is really a grassroots movement led by academics and the opposition leaders and political parties. And they've been able to mobilize people onto the streets. And now the powerful Histadrut Labor Federation, which is Israel's biggest trade union, is threatening to call a nationwide strike, which could effectively shut down the country. So a lot of momentum, I would say, for this protest.
Yeah, strength in numbers. Robert Berger, thank you.
Thank you.
Bring in now Israeli journalist and Axios contributing reporter Barak Ravid. I'm also joined by New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker as well. Barak, I want to start with you on this one. It's not necessarily surprising seeing what's happening on the ground in Israel, right? The opposition forces in the streets, along with the things that we're hearing from the opposition party amidst kind of the Israeli prime minister's marked past in that country. All that being said, though, I know that Axios received some comments from President Biden directly before this vote took place. What did he say? And is there any indication the prime minister might be influenced to negotiate a consensus deal here?
Thank you, Yasmin. Well, first, at the moment, it doesn't seem that Prime Minister Netanyahu listened to what President Biden has been saying for quite a long time, for the last 4 or 3 months, and especially 4 different times just in the last week. Once in a phone call between them, and then in 3 other opportunities, including last night in a statement that the president gave me. But Netanyahu didn't seem to listen and chose to ignore what Biden said and just move on with the unilateral legislation. What President Biden has been saying to Netanyahu, including last night, 15 hours before the vote, is that this is not what Netanyahu and other Israeli officials has been promising to the White House. And they promised that this legislation would be watered down, that this legislation would get broad consensus. And when the legislation was brought to a vote today, it was neither. It was a harsher version, and there was no consensus. It was just a unilateral step.
Peter Baker, you make a fascinating point in some of your reporting in the New York Times. As we're watching these live pictures in Tel Aviv right now, you see these opposition demonstrators in the streets surrounding this fire there, waving the Israeli flag, right? These protests have been ongoing. And what is so different, right, about this moment in time, especially when it comes to U.S.-Israeli relations and others, is that this is a purely domestic issue.
Yeah, right. There's been tension, of course, between the United States and Israel, as close as they are, going back since the founding of the state 75 years ago. I mean, every president at some point or another has had something of a quarrel with his Israeli counterpart over many issues, whether it be arms sales or the strategy toward Iran or particularly the situation with the Palestinians. But this is an unusual situation in which it is a domestic situation. It is a situation where Israel is trying to decide what kind of government it wants to have, what kind of democracy it wants to have. And that's a rarer thing for an American president to get involved in. And yet, as Barak said correctly, President Biden has chosen to give his advice, both publicly and privately. Now, he's trying to say, I'm not telling you what to do, but I am cautioning you to do it in a way that builds a broad consensus. There's clearly no broad consensus in Israel over this. And as Barak rightly said, President Biden essentially has been ignored by Prime Minister Netanyahu at this point.
Barak, there are real national security issues for Israel amidst all of this as well, showing some cracks, it seems, amidst this opposition to Bibi Netanyahu's government. All that being said, is there a real domestic concern that his government could move further and further to the right amidst this latest decision and this latest legislation?
Well, I don't know how much to the right this government still has to go. I mean, it seems that to the right of this government, there's only a wall. So I'm not sure that this is even possible. But, you know, I I want to say something about this being a domestic issue. It is a domestic issue because it has to do with Israeli democracy. But for the U.S., it's not only a domestic issue, because one of the reasons that members of this coalition, especially those who are radical right-wingers, Jewish supremacists, the reason that they want it is in order to basically neuter the Supreme Court, in order for it not to be able to stop them from taking actions against the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank. And this is part of I think, the grand scheme of things. It's not only about Israel, it's about the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. And without a functioning Supreme Court, it will be much easier for any government, and especially this one, to significantly hamper even more the rights of Palestinians in the West. And there's another issue why this is not the only domestic issue, because you see what's going on in the IDF, and there's a crisis, a real crisis in the IDF. The IDF is the most important partner of the U.S. military in the Middle East. There are U.S. forces in Syria, in Iraq, in the Gulf, and if the IDF is not functioning, if the IDF has problems, this is a national security problem for the U.S. too.
Y ahora sí empezamos a recorrer el mundo con la información, nos metemos en Israel porque finalmente Benjamín Netanyahu se salió con las suyas y han comenzado a aprobarse los distintos puntos específicos y los que rechaza la sociedad israelí de modo entero, los distintos puntos de esta modificación que Netanyahu le está realizando a el Poder Judicial, sobre todo la cláusula de la razonabilidad es la primera y era la más perturbadora para el pueblo israelí. Ahí estamos viendo una manifestación, esto fue en las últimas horas, los manifestantes bloquearon la carretera principal de Tel Aviv en las primeras horas de este día martes. Insisto, estas son imágenes de hace un ratito nada más, de hace un par de horas. La policía utilizó cañones de agua para hacer retroceder a la multitud que protestaba y los agentes se llevaron a rastras a varias personas. Las protestas masivas estallaron con furia renovada en Israel después de que los legisladores ratificaran el primer proyecto de ley de reforma judicial buscado por el primer ministro Netanyahu. Los esfuerzos de compromiso de última hora colapsaron antes, sin poder aliviar una crisis constitucional que ha estado convulsionada durante varios meses. Las manifestaciones en contra de la enmienda comenzaron temprano, con la policía arrastrando a los manifestantes que se habían encadenado a los postes y bloqueado el camino frente al Parlamento. Y por la tarde de ayer también, miles habían tomado las calles de todo el país, bloqueando carreteras y peleando con la policía. La policía israelí dijo que al menos 22 personas habían sido arrestadas el lunes. La cláusula de razonabilidad, una de las más polémicas de esta reforma que tiene varios puntos que está tratando de implementar Netanyahu, que ya ha comenzado a implementar, tiene que ver con que le resta poder a la Corte Suprema, al Poder Judicial, para que cuando hay algunas medidas del Poder Ejecutivo o el Poder Legislativo abusivas, ¿sí?, no pueda ejercer su poder. Le resta absoluto poder a la Corte Suprema de Justicia.
par des manifestants. Après une échauffourée, le responsable de la sécurité du kibbutz, furieux, a pris certains protestataires à partie, sorti son arme et tiré en l'air.
אנחנו מצביעים על החוק בקריאה. מי שאינו מעוניין להצביע מוזמן לצאת. מי שלא נעזור לו.
לכל מי שנמצא במרכז הצומת, מדבר מפקד תחנת פוריה. אתם נמצאים כרגע בהתקהלות בלתי חוקית. אני מבקש מכולם לפנות את מרכז הצומת תוך 3 דקות. היה ולא תפנו את הצומת, אנחנו נשתמש באמצעים.
Amir Tabone, so senior reporter for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Amir, thanks so much for being here. President Biden urged Prime Minister Netanyahu to wait to try and compromise on this. He didn't. These protests are really growing.
Yes, hi, Elizabeth. It's true that President Biden asked Prime Minister Netanyahu several times not to go forward with this legislation that dramatically changes the balance of power between the authorities in Israel without reaching a wider consensus. But I want to say something. President Biden has not been alone in urging Netanyahu to seek consensus. That is also true of Israeli President Isaac Herzog, who was in Washington last week and spoke before the U.S. Congress and has made a great effort to try to find some kind of an agreement. And it's also true of the heads of the security establishment in Israel, including Netanyahu's own defense minister, who pleaded with him today before the vote to delay it by a few days and try to find compromise. But the problem was Netanyahu's other political partners, the different far-right, ultra-religious parties within his coalition, vetoed any attempt for compromise and told him, if you don't pass this very controversial legislation that weakens the Supreme Court as we wrote it, we will bring down your government. And eventually, in the fight between Biden and the defense establishment and Israeli president and his far-right allies, he chose their side.
This has real implications for Israel's security. Israel is the United States' closest ally in the Middle East. Israeli pilots and soldiers have threatened to refuse to work if this referendum was passed. And if that happens, if they refuse to go to work, what happens to Israel's security and defense?
That's a very important question. I want to clarify that we're not talking as of now. It could get there, but as of now, we're not talking about people who are military members who, have a military career and are refusing to show to work. We're talking about reservists, people who have their own civilian career, but do reserve service in the Israeli military. Pilots, for example, some of them have to train as much as once a week to stay in operational capacity. And these people are now saying we will no longer show up for reserve duty because we signed a contract with a Jewish democratic state of Israel, and they believe this legislation weakens the democratic aspect of Israel significantly. And if hundreds of them actually follow through with this threat, we will find ourselves in a situation where the Israeli military loses its readiness for war. This is a very serious situation. It also impacts U.S. national security interests. And this is a great source of concern for the military leadership in Israel that has raised all the red flags in the last few days before the government. But again, the politics of the matter has overcome the national security interests, at least this time.
Amir, this is all a result of a real division between secular Israelis and the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox want a permanent exemption, for example, from serving in the military, which every Israeli, man and woman, has to do. They want to pass religious laws that might, for example, prevent men and women from sitting together on public transportation. Half of all ultra-Orthodox men don't work. They study the Talmud. They rely on government subsidies to live. Many have very little traditional education. How is this going over with secular Israelis who do work and do pay taxes and do serve in the military?
Well, Elizabeth, this is one of the most important dividing lines that we're seeing in our society right now. And I have to say, I have a lot of respect for the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, and I think it's very important for us as a country to bring them more into the modern Israeli economy and to bring them more into even the military in the places where we can do it. But the political divide right now between their political representatives who are fighting, again, for these issues you mentioned, military exemption, and a private education system funded by the state where they don't teach mathematics, don't teach English, don't teach science, is a huge long-term problem for the state of Israel. And for the population here that does serve and does pay taxes, and at the same time is looking now at a government that is trying to weaken the Supreme Court, which in Israel is the most important institution in protecting the civil rights of Israelis, all of that put together is a recipe for a social explosion. And I have to say, when we're speaking now, it's late here in Israel. Still, there are huge protests out in the streets. People are very angry. And if these issues don't get resolved in a way that is more based on consensus, we are heading down a very dangerous path for the state of Israel.
Thanks so much for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.
That massive protest in Israel igniting as Israeli lawmakers approve a key part of a divisive plan to overhaul the country's judicial system. Israeli media says that hundreds of thousands of Israelis rallied against the move as lawmakers who opposed the bill stormed out of the chamber before the vote, chanting "shame," leaving it to pass with unanimous approval. Well, part of that plan, backed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, removes the court system's ability to strike down decisions by the government. Critics say it jeopardizes democracy. Protesters today actually blocking a main road in Jerusalem in response to that vote. Here's another look at the crowds right now in Israel, still out in force despite the late hour. And our Tom Sufi Burridge joins us now from right there where it's all happening. So, Tom, just bring us up to date at this hour. What are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Well, Kira, we've just come back from the protests. They're definitely calming down to some extent. They're not, I think, at the level they were earlier on in the day, just before the vote and just after that controversial bill went through. We're getting reports that the protests are picking up a bit in Tel Aviv as well. But don't think that this is over for the protesters. I mean, one message which came through very clearly, talking to protesters this afternoon, was that they are going to continue their fight. I spoke to young mums, I spoke to students, I spoke to young professionals, and all of them are deeply concerned about their future. They see Israel going in the wrong direction. They're worried about their children's future, and they're worried about the future of democracy in this country.
So why do protesters believe that this is such a critical moment in Israeli history? Why now and why this time?
Well, they believe that a central plank, an important principle which has existed in Israel for decades, has been removed because of this vote through by the government and its lawmakers. And that principle, as you correctly explained in your intro, Kira, is that the Supreme Court has always been able to look at government decisions, and if they are highly controversial, it can deem them unreasonable. And if it decides that, then it can strike them down. Now, the government says, look, we're a democratically elected government. This has been passed by democratic processes through a democratically elected parliament. And that is true, but the protesters say this has been rushed through. This is not the way to reform the judiciary. And they believe that if there aren't these important checks and balances on any government of the day in Israel, that it's not good for democracy and it's not good for the future of the country.
So the ramifications, clearly, of today's vote are far-reaching. Let's just talk about the potential ripple effects here, Tom.
Well, look, I think there are several. I mean, one is that the unions here in Israel are threatening strikes, so that's one potential. The chaos and the uncertainty could continue. That's not great for any country when that happens. I think one key point right now, and everyone's looking at this, is whether or not army reservists, and thousands of them have said before the vote today that they would be prepared not to serve if the vote passed and that controversial bill went through. Now, it remains to be seen if they're actually going to deliver on that threat and actually carry that out. But that is an important thing that we're looking at, because obviously that has ramifications for Israeli security. And we've all looked at Israeli security through the decades. It is the one, or has been the one really unifying thing which has held this country together like glue. And now we've got this internal division and the potential that thousands of army reserves are saying, hey, we're not prepared to defend the country right now because of these changes brought in by this government, which many people here do believe is going in the wrong direction.
So what has been the reaction from the opposition, and what are the options here?
Well, you saw people, the opposition lawmakers, walking out. They boycotted the vote. They cried foul, effectively, accusing the government of misplay. The options for the opposition right now are not crystal clear. I mean, You know, they're clearly going to try and keep the momentum of the protest movement going. The government is planning much broader reforms to the judiciary. We're going to have to watch and see whether Benjamin Netanyahu and his government are going to push forward with those. And there'll be some kind of a negotiation as well. And we've had again a reaction from the Biden administration, which, you know, in some senses it's slightly diplomatic, as you'd expect. It doesn't sort of launch a full-fronted attack on a key ally. But at the same time, it's quite remarkable that a US administration is quite clearly criticizing domestic political plays by an Israeli government. I mean, that is quite extraordinary. We haven't really seen that, you know, if you look back over the years or the decades, and therefore, you know, it is an interesting moment, and it remains to be seen where this goes next.
All right, Tom Sufi Burridge, we will follow what happens next with you there out of Jerusalem. Thank you so much. And joining me to discuss some more, ABC News contributor and former senior CIA field operative, Daryl Blocker. So, Daryl, Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to shore up support domestically, but thousands of military reservists are vowing not to even fight. I mean, what does that mean for the region if there's potential conflict?
That would be an unprecedented move on behalf of Israeli Defense Forces, whether they're active duty or whether they're reserve. That would signal to everyone in the region, to their threats coming from Hezbollah, from Syria, from Iran, that, you know, that there's division within Israel that they can use to their advantage. So it's not good for the state of Israel. It's not good for democracy. But Netanyahu has, for the first time, a coalition that favors the religious over the secular. So it's not surprising that they're trying to take advantage of this. But what is surprising is that there are people who are willing to risk going to jail and risk the security of Israel to make their point about slow rolling this, or at least discussing this a bit more thoroughly.
So Netanyahu and his allies say that the changes will strengthen democracy by limiting the powers of unelected judges and giving elected officials more control over decision-making. So does this jeopardize democracy, do you think? I mean, where's the disconnect here?
I think the disconnect comes, well, actually, the disconnect dates back to when David Ben-Gurion had to make some very difficult decisions on creating the state of Israel, where he had to make, basically had to give the religious right a lot more power and strength than they had in their numbers. Now, their numbers today, through demographics, through family size, has now outpaced the secularist. There's a very good book written in 2018 called God is in the Crowd. And this former Israeli fighter pilot, now a financier who became an author, talked about this very, very issue on how it's going to, the future of Israel is going to boil down to the secularists versus the religious right.
So Israel doesn't have a formal constitution. The judiciary plays a critical oversight role in the country's system of checks and balances. So what do you see happening here?
This is nothing new. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots from back in the days of Christ, that was a division that existed amongst the Jewry at the time, and it's, 2,000 years forward, it still exists. They will work this out. The people in the streets demonstrating have spoken. God is in the crowd, so to speak. So hopefully clearer minds and will prevail in the long run. But what we're seeing is democracy in action. So I don't think it's a total threat to democracy.